welcome to episode 2 of our podcast, Literacy is Lit at Centenary University. I'm your host, Joe Pizzo. Centenary University's annual literacy conference is our setting today on the 7th of June, 2024, as we prepare to chat with Tom Marshall, the principal of Stony Lane Elementary School. He is the leader of Lit Together Learning Communities, a grassroots community for instructional teachers, coaches, and leaders. Marshall is a former staff developer for the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project. Tom is the recipient of CEL's 2017 Innovative Leadership Award through NCTE and the author of Reclaiming the Principalship, Instructional Leadership Strategies to Engage Your Community and Focus on Learning. Marshall is the director of the Paramus Summer Institutes and has served thousands of teachers in best practices in student-driven instruction. Principal Tom Marshall, welcome to our second edition of Literacy is Lit at Centenary University.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here.
Thanks for coming. Let's start out with this. Your resume reflects a strong background in literacy. When did your interest in literacy begin?
So when I was little, I enjoyed writing. I felt like writing was fun, but I didn't really read a whole lot. But I don't know how. I seemed like I was good at writing, and everyone told me I was good at writing, and I didn't really understand how that happened or what happened. There's plenty of things in life that I'm not good at, so I guess I was lucky that that was something that came easily to me. But I think my interest in really thinking about literacy in that way started when I was in college. And I started learning about that in one of my teacher prep courses. And then it really took off for me in student teaching because actually it was my junior year. I was put into a placement at the Anna C. Scott School in Leonia, where this work around literacy was amazing. And up until then, I, just like a lot of teachers, I always thought of I need to teach the way I was taught. And that was through worksheets and through things like that. And I thought that was the way, because I thought that was the only way. But then when I saw kids doing really great work, thinking very deeply and loving reading real books and writing original, authentic texts, I thought this has got to be the best way to do this.
Why is authenticity so important when we're teaching literacy?
When you don't teach with authenticity, when you don't teach in a way that's real, it's sort of like it always makes me think of Plato's allegory of the cave and the fire, and
yes.
And you see a shadow of what things really could be, and it doesn't give kids a real vision of what literacy actually is, where it's about making meaning and creating meaning through reading and writing, and if you don't do that, they'll never want to do it on their own. And think of all the voices that won't be heard if we don't do that. It's important to give kids a voice in the world.
You and I are both advocates of having parents and guardians read to their children. So let me ask you, is there a good time for parents and guardians to begin reading to their children? And what are the benefits of doing so?
I think right away, as soon as you meet your children, it's important to start introducing reading to them. Mem Fox, who is a famous children's author, also spent 26 years as a professor of reading education at the Teachers College in Sydney, Australia. And in her book, Reading Magic, she talks about the importance of reading to children at a very, very young age. And she tells the story of the fact that it takes about 1,000 stories for a child to hear 1,000 stories for their mind to be ready to really understand what reading is and to be ready to learn how to read. And she said, it sounds like an overwhelming number, but if you think about it, that if you start it when they're born and a story takes 5 minutes and you tell them 3 stories a day, then by the time they're 1, they already have 1,000 stories that they've heard. And that sounds a lot less scary. And she also tells the story about a friend of hers who knew a librarian and was trying to pick out a birthday gift for her child. And the librarian suggested, well, why don't you get books? And her friend was like, books? She can't even read. And then they thought like, wow, what a shame that that little girl is never going to have the experience of trying to like sneak books under the covers with a flashlight when it's bedtime, and all the different reading experiences that they're not going to have the chance to have in life.
So if it's important for the kids to be read to, it has to be important for them to read as well. Is there a very positive connection between being read to and being prepared to be interested enough to pick up a book yourself?
I think so, because when you're read to, you hear a lot about the music of language. You hear how language should sound. You hear how good reading should sound. You hear a lot of things about how sentences are put together, that there's a certain rhythm to them, that there's a logic to the way that grammar goes and syntax goes, and all that can be done without worksheets, just by doing that. There was a wonderful professor and author who was a friend of mine, and the world lost her a couple of years ago. Her name was Sandra Wilde. She wrote a lot of great books about lots of different things in education, but mostly around literacy and spelling and grammar. But she also wrote books about math. But she was just one of those brilliant people. And one day I invited her to our summer institute in New Jersey, and she was doing a keynote, and my son was 2 years old at the time, and she knew that. And so she's in the middle of her keynote address, and I'm sitting in the audience, and she says, Tom, where are you? And then I thought, oh no, I'm getting called out. And she said, how old is your son? And I said, 2. And then she said, can your son speak in full sentences? And I said, yes, hoping that that was the right answer. And it was. And then she said, can he diagram those sentences? And I said, no. And she says, well, there you have it. That's the point. Kids learn to speak and kids learn to use language before they can talk about it at such an abstract way. So it's really important for kids to have the chance to be exposed to all different methodologies and all different modes of language, right? There is a researcher named Lisa Delpit who tells us I believe the book was called Other People's Children, that until they're in about 6th grade, monolingual English-speaking kids can't talk about grammar in such an abstract way, right? Because they just don't have the experience with the language to be able to reach that level of abstraction. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't tell them what a noun is and what a verb is, and we don't teach them how to punctuate. It's not about that. But the high level of talking about grammar in such an abstract way is something that kids need a lot of exposure to language to before they can ever get there.
Every parent and guardian wants their child to be at least on grade level, if not beyond. And they worry if their child is slumping back a little bit, or if they're not doing something by a certain age. So is there an age by which children should be reading?
So it depends on what you call reading, because if we think about what reading really, really is, reading is taking anything that has print on it or pictures and making meaning of it, right? And so if we think about that, if that's the definition of reading at a certain age, at a very young age, at a preschool age, yeah, they should be doing that from the time they can talk, right? Because if they're looking at a text and they're able to think about it and they're able to talk about it, they're reading, right? Now, that's not good enough for every age, but because certainly we want them to be reading with a high level of accuracy and interpretation, when they're older. But that can't start unless they have those early childhood experiences. So it's critical for kids to be exposed to books and stories and other things like that, and it's just about taking it in visually, thinking about it, talking about it, making meaning. That's how kids make sense of the world.
So experience, then, you're saying, is very important, and it helps to reinforce and strengthen that whole process of learning to read and becoming a better reader.
Definitely. The experience is what, like, everything that we ever learn in our lives, whether it's swimming or driving or teaching, the real learning happens while you're doing it. The real learning happens while you're doing it. No one really learns how to swim by reading in a manual, right? You learn to swim by getting in the water and making mistakes and enjoying it, hopefully, And the same thing is true for reading, right? You can't really learn how to read just by hearing what reading is and what it will be one day when you actually learn all your letters, and one day you'll have the chance to put it all together, and one day you'll be able to have ideas about a book, and one day reading will be fun for you. No, it's got to be something that you do the whole process, even if it's messy, when you're young.
The low levels of literacy give a challenge to every teacher and specialist I've ever met. In your experience, what have you found to be the major causes of students having these low levels of literacy?
So it depends on what we're calling low levels of literacy. If we're looking at standardized testing scores, I was just in a conversation with somebody named Dr. Sam Bomarito, who's out of St. Louis. He's got over 50 years of experience in education.
Excellent gentleman.
Do you know him?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, he's wonderful. So one of the things he was saying, and he was quoting someone, and I don't have it in front of me, so I can't remember who he quoted, but the idea is that a lot of people in the current conversation around science of reading are saying that balanced literacy is something that made test scores go down. And he says, but if you look back decades and decades and decades, the literacy levels as assessed by standardized tests have been low, right? And so it's not necessarily about the instruction. It's not necessarily about the students even. It's about the test. And so if that's the cloth that we're measuring this with, then that's a misstatement. Sometimes these tests also use passages that aren't really good indicators of literacy. So for example, it was probably about 10 years ago, the third grade reading test had a passage in it that was from Tolstoy. And if you look at the Lexile level of the passage, it was actually a 10th grade sophomore reading level. And they were giving that on the third grade test. And the problem with that is that, it gets into the newspaper or on the internet. It says third graders can't read, but it doesn't say third graders can't read 10th grade texts, right? So some of it is in the news, in the media, and kind of how things are portrayed. And in fact, I explained that to a parent in my school at the time, and I said, the passage was Tolstoy, and she said, well, I feel like that's a very appropriate level, a very appropriate text for third grade. And I said, really? And she says, yes, that's a great Disney movie. And I said, no, not Toy Story, Tolstoy. And she said, oh, well, what's that? And
Oh my gosh.
and it's just funny how we hear parts of the story,
Right.
but we don't hear the whole thing. And sometimes we have to remember that testing, the standardized testing industry, is an industry. It's a business who wants to make money, and so there's all sorts of things in lawmakers' hands that allocate money for certain things, and sometimes the kids become part of that, right? And the test becomes a vehicle for how money is distributed. And so we always have to look at that carefully and think, how is this information being used?
Self-esteem and economic factors are very important in this whole process, yet we tend to eschew them. We tend to back away from them, and maybe we try to grasp onto data and almost strangle it rather than looking at some of those things that maybe aren't as easy to measure but are as important, if not more important, to include. In your opinion, how much does self-esteem play? How much do those economic factors play in ensuring success for our readers?
I feel like that's really two very important different things, though. So I think in terms of the access to books, there are definitely families that have access to lots and lots of books, rich literature, engaging literature, nonfiction books, and those kids are at a great advantage because they have all the experience from a very young age, right? To be literate, right? To have lots of opportunities to read. Like the practice is one of the most important things, right? Brian Camborne tells us from his Conditions of Learning theory that practice and exposure to something is something that makes you learn, right? And if kids come from families that, because of financial hardships or whatever reason, don't have access to books, they're naturally going to be at a disadvantage. So it's critical that school districts recognize that and give students lots of access to books by giving them lots of books, right? And giving them time within the day to read those books and time within their homework to read those books, because that's just what's necessary. Somebody at this conference this morning quoted Donalyn Miller, who is the book whisperer that everyone knows. You wouldn't have a good football team if they didn't have equipment, because they wouldn't be able to play. Well, you also can't have good readers who don't have access to the equipment they need, which for readers, it's books, and it's good books. It's books that they can see themselves in. It's books that they can access the print and read. And that kind of ties into this other part about self-esteem, because a big thing that can negatively impact students' self-esteem around reading is if they don't feel successful. So there are lots of practices that have been in place for the last 100 years in American schools, like the whole class novel. And the thing is, like, while the whole class novel can build community because students are talking about the same text, if they're expected to read all the print inside of a text and they're not able to do that because it's above their reading level, well, they're getting kind of the wrong message of what reading should feel like. It's not the same experience for them. And maybe the teacher loves that book and loves teaching that book, but all kids need a chance to read books where they can understand 96 to 98% of the words. That's what Richard Allington tells us. In order for students to feel successful, to be able, not even just feel successful, to be successful. And then that creates the feeling of success. So it's important to consider reading levels. So decodable texts are important, but also other texts are important. Now, I say that that's true, except when it's not, because levels can also have a negative effect on students, right? Because it can be stigmatizing if a student is always on the lower end of the reading level continuum in the class, so they also have to be exposed to books that are what are called high interest books. So even if the text is hard, but it's about a topic that I really care about, I'm able to access more of the meaning inside the book because of my prior knowledge, and combining that with the new ideas that I'm seeing and reading inside the book, then that's the case. So levels are good, and they're important, but anything that's done too much can also have an adverse effect.
Now, as you know, there's a lot of controversy in the field of reading, and one of the major ones happens to center around teaching phonics or taking a little bit more open, more balanced literacy approach. Would you briefly explain each of those approaches to our listeners?
So it's funny because in this current conversation about science of reading and what the best way to teach students how to read, there's a lot of, it's almost like you're un-American if you believe this or you believe that. It's another thing in our society that polarizes people. And it shouldn't be, right? We should all gather around the actual research and do what we can to implement that. And Dr. Sam Bomarito, who I just mentioned to you a couple minutes ago, one of the things that he said in that recent conversation, which I think is brilliant, is like, if you go back to ancient Greek culture, right? There was Aristotle and there was Socrates, and Aristotle believed in direct, explicit instruction, and Socrates believed in what's known as the Socratic method, right? Inquiry. And so the conversation about, do we just teach things explicitly like phonics, or do we let kids explore and discover it, right? That's a 2,000-year-old argument. That's not something that happened ever since, recent events here. So that's something that's never, ever been decided in the last 2,000 years. Now, that being said, synthetic phonics, or phonics that's taught through like worksheets and workbooks, is good, but it's limiting, because if kids never ever have the chance to apply that in actual reading and meaning making, then they're just learning it in theory, and it's going to go away, and they're never going to play because they're not going to want to read. So that being said, it's not about, do you teach phonics or do you not teach phonics? It's about, how do you teach it with a sense of balance? And that's where balanced literacy comes from. Balanced literacy, like many things in education, the term has been sort of used in lots of different ways by different people based on whatever they might know or think they know. And so Dr. Sam says that the definition of balanced literacy that is probably the most head-on one is the one that was created by Michael Presley years and years ago. And Michael Presley is gone now, but his son Tim has continued his work. But the idea of balanced literacy is giving kids the opportunity to read books, be engaged by them, make meaning, right? And do the same thing on the writing end also, right? So they're writing to express their ideas and put those ideas out in the world so that one day somebody will read them, right? But while you're doing that, you're also spending some time both implicitly and explicitly teaching the phonics and all the other conventions of language, right? The punctuation and the spelling and grammar and syntax, like all those things do get taught. But the thing is that they need to be both embedded in the context of the real work, but also taught outside so that it gets some special attention so kids can learn to be metacognitive about that.
In a language arts classroom, writing is always a major part, as it is in most classrooms. What are some of the important strategies to use when teaching kids writing?
So in writing, just like in reading, they're never going to get anywhere unless they're given the chance to express their ideas. Like writing needs time. Time needs to be carved into the day for both implicit and explicit teaching of writing. Okay. So we have to remember that there's different types of writing, right? There's something called low stakes writing. And there's high stakes writing. High stakes writing is writing that's written for an audience. So it has to be polished, right? At an age appropriate level, right? Polished kindergarten writing looks different than polished freshman writing. We have to understand that's a reasonable expectation. And low stakes writing is writing that we do when we jot down notes, right? When we're reading an assignment and we're taking notes to process what we're thinking about, right? And grow our thinking. Low stakes writing is something that happens while we're reading, while we're learning science or social studies or math or anything. It's that kind of writing that's the audience is just us, and it serves a higher purpose of helping us learn something else. So another thing that's important for us to remember when we're teaching writing is kids need access to rich texts that are good models of what good writing looks like, that are good models of story, of nonfiction, right? Because you can't give what you can't get. Right. So like it's important for us to remember that kids have to be exposed to really, really good examples of writing. I think in writing, it's also important for students to have the sense of choice in what they're going to write about. Not all writing can be prompted because otherwise students are going to think they need the teacher to tell them what to write about and they're never going to try it. Right. I remember when I was in fourth grade, there were these creative writing prompts in the back of the room. And if you had extra time, you would write them. And I remember one of them was, what color is love? And I looked at that and I thought, I'm 9 years old. I don't know. Or like, there was another one that said, if my shoes could talk. And I thought, if my shoes could talk, then I belong in a different school because that's not like, it's just not real. It was so fake. And some kids would do a good job writing those stories. Right. And because they had some skills, but it was silly work that an adult was making them do. And pretty much 9 times out of 10, the silly work was you would write a story so that a teacher could check your spelling. And the thing is, that's a very backwards way of looking at the world. We don't write so that we can become better spellers. We learn to be good spellers so we can be effective writers that can express their ideas so that others will understand them and it'll make the world a better place. Kids need a lot of time to work with independence in all different aspects of writing, and they need to be taught good ways to elaborate on their writing, right? Sometimes when we were kids, I remember the teacher would, bang her fist and say, add more detail, add more detail, add more detail. But the teacher wasn't very detailed in what she meant by details. So we would write details that made the writing worse. It made it less focused. It made it, there was a lot of things that had to get cleaned up after that. And then the teacher would get frustrated and, but sometimes we have to be really explicit in what we mean by by adding more detail, right? And so in narrative writing, that looks like in the middle of a bunch of action sentences, putting in sentences that are about thoughts or feelings or setting, right? In the middle of nonfiction writing, where we might have a bunch of sentences that are facts, followed by facts, followed by facts, we need to have other things in there, different kinds of facts, right? So maybe thoughts, or maybe quotes or statistics or anecdotes. We want to make sure that the kids are doing that. And now within that, they also need some choice. Because if I'm the kind of writer that writes with all dialogue, I don't need to be told today is Wednesday, so you have to write dialogue, right? That's not what I need as a writer. So it's important for teachers to tailor their instruction to what their students are really doing. That's what's called a student-driven environment. And that's what balanced literacy is. And that's what creates lifelong readers and writers.
So it seems to me that you're saying that reading and writing kind of complement each other, and that the instructor needs to consider both how one can drive the other, how one can complement the other, and how it can address whatever the needs are of the students in the most efficient way possible.
Definitely. And I think that when we're in a student-driven type of environment like balanced literacy, like that naturally lends itself to doing that type of work, right? So within that structure, there's different components. And some people think, balanced literacy means doing a really good mini lesson because that's something that we see in some of the resources that are available, right? But that's only a little teeny tiny part, right? There's other things that have to go into a truly balanced literacy environment, right? There's components like when they're young, in kindergarten or first grade, they do something called interactive writing, where the teacher guides the students in writing something together. And there's a lot of work that goes into the phonemic awareness and the encoding strategies that they use, right? But it's highly engaging and it's authentic because the product is always something real. It's a sign, or it's a letter, or it's something that they actually need, right? There's also shared reading, where students are looking at a text together. They're learning about how to engage in word attack, or in fluency, or in easy interpretation, or when they're older, in sophisticated interpretation. There's read aloud, where students are being read to by the teacher, and there's a great emphasis on comprehension, right? And kind of talking through the story, but not just at a very literal level, like saying back the details or the facts of the story, but also, trying to get different kinds of thoughts. I was a classroom teacher for 9 years, and there were books that I liked to read aloud every single year. And every single year, the story would come out differently because of the kids that were sitting there, the experiences that they had, the experiences that I had. There are books that you read differently when your life changes. There's a beautiful chapter book by Patricia McLaughlin called Baby. And I read that many, many times, but it was different the year that I became a father, right? And I had a baby of my own. And I started thinking about life through that way, right? Of thinking about my baby and what that, the experiences that gave me. It's just such a different way. And that's real, right? That's real. So all those components of balanced literacy just make the teaching of literacy so much more complete and so much more real.
It seems that the personal experience kind of puts that trite icing on the cake. It gives it that little extra bit that maybe wasn't there the time before.
Definitely. And it's like that for all of us, right? As adult readers, right? And there's books that we don't want to read because they remind us of things we don't want to think about, or they kind of they rub us the wrong way with either our values or what our understandings are. And similarly, there's books that we're drawn to because of our experiences, because of the people we know. And so it's critical for us to remember that we're not just teaching reading as something that's another hoop that kids are going to want to jump through because a teacher's making them. It's not a skill that they're going to learn so that one day they'll read books. It's a skill that we want them to understand that they're doing from the time they're little and making meaning from the first text that they're looking at.
Let me ask you this. What advice would you like to give to our students in our literacy and education programs here at Centenary University and at other universities as well?
So I think the very, like, if I had to think of what the number one thing is, I would say be a reader, right? You can't you can't get kids to read if you don't do it yourself, at least a little, right? And you have to know who you are as a reader, and you have to practice it. Just like, we wouldn't want to hire a phys ed teacher that wasn't in shape, right? And we wouldn't hire a driver ed instructor who didn't know how to drive, right? And so it's really important for us to be readers. And even if your job is not teaching reading, you have to be a reader because it affects no matter what you teach. It helps to make you into a thinker, and so it will give you new ideas on things to teach as well, like as far as like the strategies that you use, right? And if you don't love it, it's going to be a chore. So at least start to love it a little. Okay. That's a very important thing. I think the other thing is that when you become a teacher, you become the ambassador for education, right? To your family and your friends around you, who don't know teaching, and it's not their fault. They're not teachers, right? I don't know medicine because I'm not a doctor. There's lots of things I don't know. But we become the ambassadors. And the thing is, since everybody went to school, they think they know a lot about education, and they hear things in social media or on the news or from their friends. And sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's kind of misinformation. And so we have to be really well informed about how teaching works, about what's going on in the teaching world around us. We have to be well versed in research. We have to be well versed in the things that are going on with the laws, right, around teaching, because we're the ambassadors for that. So Dr. Sam had mentioned, like I didn't think of it until he said it that way, but in the current science of reading conversation, there's two branches of science of reading, right? And so one is science of reading, which is the research that shows what the best practices are in the way students learn to read and how they sustain that reading life forever, right? But then there's also the science of reading social media. The house is on fire, everybody get out, right? There's a crisis that just, happened because of either COVID or because of balanced literacy or because of, nobody's teaching phonics. Like, no, like that's not true, right? So, and a lot of people are hearing that because they're so attached to their phones and to the social media that that's all they're exposed to, right? And so they believe it. And so it's important for us to be really well versed in that first part, in the actual science of reading, which is in direct contradiction a lot of times with what's on social media, right? You have to remember that. Just like the testing, like there's people making money off of things. And so we have to be critical consumers of even that. So if you're a teacher and, you love working with kids, like this is another part of the job that you may not have thought you signed up for, but you really have to sign up for it because you're an ambassador to the rest of the world on what education really is.
So, Tom, is there a message that you'd like to give to parents and guardians?
I think it's important to always remember how important it is to listen to your child's teacher and to kind of talk back and like ask questions about how you can be the best partner with them in supporting the way your child learns how to read and write and anything, right? And I think like that the relationship that you have with the people at school who also love and care for your kids is really important. It's important for children to see that the adults in their lives are unified, and so if you're having a conversation with your child's teacher, try to always remember that you're trying to be partners together with them.
Tom, do you also have a message for the parents and guardians?
So I think one of the most important things for parents and guardians to remember is that, you are the number one advocate for your child, and you should be, right? Because you love your child more than anyone in the world, right? But you also have to remember that the teachers and the principals are there to partner with you. They're not there to be an adversary. They're not someone that you have to check up on. They're professionals who are also the advocate for your child. They're also there to make sure that your child is safe and happy and learning. They're also there to make sure that your child grows up to be the best person that he or she can be. So it's important to have that partner stance, right? It's important to have that partner stance. And that's true for reading and writing and other kinds of learning. It's also true for other parts of your child's life, right? So there was a social worker in our school district many years ago. She's since retired, but I remember she used to say to parents, like, if the school calls you to talk about something that your child might have done, that's a gift, right? Like if there was a behavior that maybe wasn't the right thing, that's a gift because it's a chance for you to have that conversation with the teacher and with the child, right? To help that child learn the right life lesson. Because in elementary school, especially, the stakes are low, right? If there's some sort of conflict at recess or there's something else going on, right? The stakes are low. And it's a chance for you and the teacher to work together to help your child while the stakes are low. It's safe to make those mistakes. But as they get older and older, those stakes get higher, right? And so if we don't listen to the teachers in moments like that, then one day it's not going to be the teacher calling, it's going to be the police calling, or it's going to be some other kind of problem that's going to be a much harder problem to fix. So it's really important to, not just in literacy, but in everything, partner with your teachers because they are your child's other best friend, right? Outside of you, they're their greatest advocate outside of you. And so whatever you can do, it's important to really listen to them and be a partner with them.
You've given us a lot of information, and we're very appreciative of that. And there may be some folks out there who would like more information. So for those who wish to reach out to you, how may they do so?
Well, so you can reach me on email, and my email is Dear Mr. Marshall. So it's Dear MR Marshall at gmail.com. That's one way. I also have a Twitter account if people are on Twitter. And my address there is at Tom Lit Together. And Lit Together is the name of this organization that I run to just unite people in the conversation around education. So it's at Tom Lit Together. And during COVID, we were doing lots of screencasts for kids, right? Because they were at home learning and it was asynchronous and we all know what that was like. And so I was helping our teachers in our district make screencasts. So I was cranking them out like constantly during the pandemic. And so when the pandemic ended, there I was with about 150 videos. I said, what am I going to do with these videos? So I turned them into a YouTube channel, and I've continued to work on that YouTube channel. And you can also go on there. Most of the videos are just for kids, like they're read alouds or they're a math game, or there's something called a wonder video, which is it's a 1-minute video where I kind of show them something and I don't tell them what it is. I just ask them questions they can ask themselves so they can explore it and think on their own. And so I've continued making these videos. And so you can see those videos if you just go into YouTube and you see, you put Mr. Marshall's super awesome YouTube channel, and you can find it, like and subscribe if you'd like. But that's another place where we can communicate.
Thank you so much. And before we close today, just a point of information. We mentioned Twitter. There are some folks calling it X. So for
yes, X.
who are calling it X, we tip our hat to you, and we'll acknowledge that for you as well. Principal Tom Marshall, thank you so much for giving us your time and your energy, your wisdom, and for chatting with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Joe. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for joining us for episode 2 of our podcast, Literacy is Lit at Centenary University. Check out our literacy offerings and all that our fine university has to offer at centenaryuniversity.edu. For Literacy is Lit at Centenary University, I'm Joe Pizzo. Have a great day.